Why won't Artemis 2 land on the moon? 4 astronauts are out there right now, closer to the lunar surface than any human in 54 years, and they are going to fly right past it. The lander doesn't exist. The rocket beneath them was designed by a congressional act to save jobs, not to reach the surface. And the heat shield protecting them on the way home cracked apart the only time it was tested. Tonight, we ride with them around the far side, through the silence, through the fire, and into the question nobody at NASA wants to answer. If that sounds like your kind of journey, hit subscribe, get cozy, and let's begin. Part 1. The Elephant on the Launch Pad. Right now, as you're listening to this, 4 human beings are farther from Earth than anyone has been in more than half a century. They launched 3 days ago from the same stretch of Florida coastline where Apollo left for the moon, riding a column of fire that shook the ground for miles. Their spacecraft, Orion, is hurtling through the void at thousands of kilometers per hour, aimed at the moon. And when they get there, they will fly around it, take some photographs and come home. They will not land. Let that sit for a second. We landed on the moon in 1969. It took 8 years from the moment President Kennedy said the words to the moment Neil Armstrong's boot pressed into the regolith. 8 years. The smartphone in your pocket has more computing power than every machine NASA used during the entire Apollo program combined. We have reusable rockets now. We have telescopes that can see galaxies forming 13 billion years ago. We have mapped the moon's surface down to the meter, and yet here we are in 2026 watching 4 astronauts fly 250,000 miles to the moon, loop around the backside and come straight home without touching the surface. Why? That is the question that this video is really about, and the answer is not simple. It is not one thing. It is a tangle of engineering decisions, political compromises, institutional fear, and a fundamental shift in what we are willing to risk when we put humans on top of rockets. The answer involves a $4.1 billion rocket that cannot carry a lander, a congressional act that designed a spacecraft by committee, a risk calculation that shifted from accepting a 1 in 10 chance of killing the crew to demanding 1 in 30, and a program that may not survive long enough to ever put boots on the moon again. But let's start with the most straightforward piece. The simplest reason Artemis 2 is not landing on the moon is that the lander does not exist yet. See, the Artemis program does not work like Apollo did. Apollo was elegant. Everything launched together on a single rocket, the Saturn V. The command module where the crew lived, the service module that provided propulsion, and the lunar module that actually landed on the surface. All of it stacked together, riding one launch vehicle to the moon. One rocket, one launch, one mission. If you had the crew and you had the Saturn V, you could go to the moon and land. Period. Artemis does not work that way. The Artemis architecture splits the crew vehicle from the landing vehicle into 2 entirely separate systems that have to meet up in space. The crew rides to the moon aboard Orion, launched on the Space Launch System, or SLS. The lander is a modified version of SpaceX's Starship, called the Human Landing System, or HLS. These 2 vehicles launch separately, on different rockets, at different times, and they have to rendezvous in lunar orbit before anyone can go down to the surface. And here is where it gets complicated. Before Starship HLS can even leave Earth orbit, it has to be fueled. Starship is enormous. It is the largest rocket ever built, and getting it to the moon requires filling it with liquid methane and liquid oxygen in orbit. That means SpaceX has to launch somewhere between 10 and 16 separate tanker flights, each one docking with HLS and transferring propellant in zero gravity, before the lander has enough fuel to make the trip. This process is called orbital propellant transfer, and it has never been done at this scale. SpaceX completed a small-scale fluid transfer demonstration in 2025, but transferring a few hundred kilograms of fluid between 2 connected stages is a very different thing from building a functioning gas station in orbit and filling a spacecraft the size of a 15-story building. And the thing is, even if SpaceX solved the refueling problem tomorrow, the process of getting from refueling works to crew is on the surface. involves a chain of events that has never been attempted. Let me walk you through it, because the complexity of the Artemis 3 landing, if it ever happens, puts the simplicity of Apollo into sharp relief. First, SpaceX launches a Starship Depot variant to low Earth orbit. This is essentially a fuel tank in space. It parks in orbit and waits. Then SpaceX begins the tanker campaign, 10 to 16 separate Starship launches, each one docking with the depot and offloading liquid methane and liquid oxygen through a cryogenic transfer interface that has never been tested with full propellant loads. Cryogenic propellants are not like pumping gasoline. Liquid methane boils at minus 161 degrees Celsius. Liquid oxygen boils at minus 183. In the thermal environment of low Earth orbit, where one side of the spacecraft is facing the Sun at plus 150 degrees and the other side faces deep space at minus 150, keeping those propellants from boiling off during the weeks or months it takes to complete the refueling campaign is an engineering challenge that no one has solved at scale. Once the depot is full, the propellant is transferred to Starship HLS, the human landing system itself. HLS then fires its engines and departs Earth orbit for the Moon, entering a near rectilinear halo orbit, or NRHO, a highly elliptical orbit around the Moon that brings it close to the lunar surface at its lowest point. HLS parks in NRHO and waits for the crew to arrive on Orion. Meanwhile, on a completely separate timeline, SLS launches Orion with the crew. The crew flies to the Moon, essentially the same trajectory Artemis 2 is flying right now, and enters NRHO. Orion rendezvous with Starship HLS docks, and 2 crew members transfer from Orion into HLS. They seal the hatches, undock, and HLS descends to the lunar surface. The remaining 2 crew members stay in Orion, orbiting the Moon, waiting for their colleagues to finish the surface mission and return. After the surface mission, currently planned for about a week, the 2 surface crew members reboard HLS, launch from the lunar surface, ascend back to NRHO, rendezvous and dock with Orion again, transfer back, seal up, and Orion departs for Earth. The entire sequence requires 2 separate launch campaigns, a dozen or more individual rocket launches, multiple orbital rendezvous and docking events in 2 different orbits, and a surface landing and ascent from the Moon, all of which must succeed sequentially with no single failure allowed. Compare that to Apollo, launch Saturn V, fly to Moon, enter orbit, land, come back, 1 rocket, 1 launch, 1 sequence. The Artemis architecture is not more complex because the engineering is better. It is more complex because the foundational vehicle, SLS, cannot carry everything at once, and that limitation cascades through the entire mission design. That is the engineering answer. But here is the thing, and this is where the story gets more interesting than a hardware delay. The engineering answer only explains why they cannot land right now. It does not explain why the architecture is designed this way in the first place. It does not explain why we went from a single rocket that could do the entire job in 1969 to a system that requires 2 separate rockets, a dozen refueling flights, and a rendezvous in lunar orbit just to get 2 astronauts to the surface. To understand that, you have to go back to a piece of legislation signed in 2010, and what you find when you get there might change how you think about the entire Artemis program. Part 2. The rocket that Congress built. In 2011, the Space Shuttle flew for the last time. After 30 years of service, 135 missions, 2 catastrophic losses, Challenger in 1986 and Columbia in 2003, the program was retired, and when the shuttle ended, something else was supposed to take its place. NASA had already been working on the next generation. A program called Constellation, announced by President George W. Bush in 2004, was designed to send humans back to the Moon by 2020. Constellation included a new crew capsule called Orion, a new heavy-lift rocket called Ares 5, and a lunar lander called Altair. The whole architecture was built from the ground up around the mission of returning to the Moon and eventually going to Mars. By 2010, Constellation had spent $9 billion, and a review panel under the Obama administration concluded that the program was over budget, behind schedule, and unlikely to achieve its goals with available funding. President Obama cancelled Constellation in 2010. $9 billion gone. The lunar lander gone. The heavy lift rocket gone. The only piece that survived was the Orion capsule, which was far enough along in development that cancelling it would have cost almost as much as finishing it. Now, here is where politics enters the picture. When Constellation was cancelled, Congress was not happy. Not because Congress was deeply committed to lunar exploration, but because Constellation employed tens of thousands of people across multiple states. Solid rocket boosters were built in Utah. The core stage was manufactured in Louisiana. Engines and integration happened in Alabama. These were not just jobs. They were jobs in the districts of powerful senators and representatives who sat on the committees that controlled NASA's budget. So Congress did something unusual. They passed the 2010 NASA Authorization Act, and embedded in that legislation was a very specific instruction. NASA's next heavy lift rocket must use existing space shuttle hardware, infrastructure and workforce. The solid rocket boosters from the shuttle program, the RS-25 engines from the shuttle program, the manufacturing facilities that built shuttle components, the workforce that assembled them. Congress did not just tell NASA to build a rocket. Congress told NASA how to build it, what parts to use, which factories to keep open, which contractors to preserve. The result was the Space Launch System, SLS, and SLS was not designed around a mission. It was designed around a supply chain. Let me put some numbers on this, because the numbers tell the real story. SLS Block 1, the version flying right now on Artemis 2, can deliver approximately 27,000 kilograms to trans-lunar injection. That is the mass it can send toward the Moon. Saturn V, the rocket that flew Apollo, could deliver approximately 48,600 kilograms to trans-lunar injection. That is nearly double. Saturn V could carry the crew capsule, the service module, and the lunar lander, all on a single launch. SLS cannot. SLS can carry Orion and its service module, and that is essentially it. There is no room for a lander. The rocket does not have the payload capacity, and the cost. Saturn V, adjusted for inflation to $2026, cost roughly $1.5 billion per launch. NASA flew it 13 times in 4 years. SLS cost approximately $4.1 billion per launch. That is the rocket, the Orion capsule, and the ground systems. According to NASA's own Office of Inspector General, and NASA can fly it roughly once per year. So we are looking at a rocket that costs nearly 3 times as much as Saturn V, flies far less often, and carries significantly less payload. But it keeps the same factories open and the same workforce employed. Let me break down what $4.1 billion actually buys you, because the number alone does not tell the whole story. That figure, from NASA's own Inspector General, covers the production cost of the SLS rocket, the Orion spacecraft, the ground infrastructure at Kennedy Space Center needed to process and launch the stack, and the operational costs, the labor, materials, facilities, and overhead required for a single launch. It does not include the research and development costs that were already spent developing SLS and Orion. Those sunk costs, spread across more than a decade of development, push the total program expenditure into the tens of billions. By the time Artemis 2 launched 3 days ago, the United States had spent somewhere north of $90 billion on the Artemis program as a whole, counting SLS development, Orion development, ground systems upgrades, the human landing system contracts, and the spacesuits. $90 billion. For context, the entire Apollo program, from Kennedy's speech to the last moon landing, cost approximately $25 billion in 1960s currency, which is roughly $250 billion in today's dollars. But Apollo delivered 12 crewed missions, 6 moon landings, and 842 pounds of lunar samples in that budget. Artemis has so far delivered one uncrewed test flight and one crewed flyby, with the first landing still a year or more away. Now, is that comparison entirely fair? No. The economics of spaceflight have changed. Labour costs are different. Safety standards are different. The regulatory environment is different. Apollo was a crash program with wartime urgency and blank check funding during a period of economic growth. Artemis is a peacetime program operating under continuing resolutions and budget constraints. But the comparison reveals something real. The system that produces SLS is not designed to be cost-effective. It is designed to be politically durable, and political durability has its own cost. A cost measured not just in dollars, but in years, in launch cadence, and in opportunities missed while the program grinds through its incremental milestones. The workforce argument is the most politically potent piece of this. SLS sustains approximately 30,000 jobs across 44 states, according to NASA's own economic impact reports. Those are real people, with real families, doing real work. The engineers at Stennis Space Center in Mississippi, who test the RS-25 engines, are not padding their hours. The technicians at the Michoud Assembly Facility in New Orleans, who weld the core stage tankage, are not performing fake work. The solid rocket booster specialists at Northrop Grumman's facility in Promontory, Utah, are building real hardware. The work is real. The rocket is real. But the question is not whether the work is real. The question is whether the rocket is the right one. When Congress wrote the 2010 Authorization Act, they made a choice. They chose to preserve the industrial base over optimizing the mission. And once that choice was made, everything that followed, the two-launch architecture, the Starship HLS dependency, the 10 to 16 refueling flights, the $4 billion per launch price tag, was downstream of that original decision. The lander is not ready because the rocket cannot carry one. The rocket cannot carry one because it was designed around leftover shuttle parts. The shuttle parts were mandated because Congress wanted to save jobs, and the jobs needed saving because the shuttle was retired. It is a chain of decisions, each one rational in its own context, that collectively produced an architecture optimized for political survival rather than lunar capability. That is not corruption. It is not a conspiracy. It is how the American political system processes expensive, long-duration technical programs. And Artemis is the product of that process. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the stated purpose of the legislation. The 2010 Authorization Act was not written to optimize for lunar capability. It was written to preserve the industrial base of the Space Shuttle program. And the rocket that emerged from that legislation is the reason Artemis needs two separate launches to do what Apollo did in one. If you have been following the Artemis saga on this channel, and we have covered this from multiple angles, from the economic drivers behind going back in the first place to the nightmare scenarios of what could go wrong in transit, you know that the story of Artemis is not just an engineering story, it is a political story. And the SLS is perhaps the purest expression of what happens when a spacecraft is designed by committee rather than by mission. Now, you might be thinking, okay, the architecture is not ideal, but why not just push through it? Accept more risk, move faster, compress the timeline the way Apollo did. The answer to that question involves a shift in philosophy that is just as important as the shift in hardware, and it starts with a number that changed everything. Part 3. The price of caution. During the Apollo program, NASA internally estimated the probability of losing a crew at roughly 1 in 10 per mission. 1 in 10. That means for every flight to the moon, there was approximately a 10% chance that the astronauts would not come home, and they flew anyway. 12 times to the moon, 6 landings, 3 astronauts lost in the Apollo 1 fire during a ground test, and 1 crew, Apollo 13, nearly lost in transit when a service module oxygen tank exploded 200,000 miles from Earth. The reason they accepted that risk was context. The Cold War was not a metaphor. The Soviet Union had beaten the United States to every major spaceflight milestone. First satellite, first human in orbit, first spacewalk, first woman in space. Losing the moon was not an abstract embarrassment. In the strategic calculus of the 1960s, it was a national security concern. The risk of killing astronauts was weighed against the risk of conceding technological supremacy to the Soviets. And in that framework, 1 in 10 was acceptable. That framework no longer exists. 2 disasters changed NASA's institutional relationship with risk in ways that are still shaping decisions today. On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch when an O-ring in the right solid rocket booster failed in cold weather. 7 crew members died, including Krista McAuliffe, who would have been the first teacher in space. The investigation revealed that NASA managers had overridden engineer warnings about the O-ring's performance in low temperatures. The agency had accepted risk it should not have accepted, and 7 people died because of it. 17 years later, on February 1, 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry when a piece of insulation foam, a piece the size of a small suitcase, struck the leading edge of the left wing during launch and created a hole. Superheated plasma entered the wing during re-entry, and the orbiter broke apart over Texas. 7 more crew members died. Again, the investigation found that NASA's organizational culture had normalized risk, treating foam strikes as a maintenance issue rather than a safety threat. After Columbia, NASA's relationship with acceptable risk fundamentally changed. The agency implemented new safety frameworks, new oversight boards, new mandatory risk assessments at every stage. The current Artemis program targets a crew loss probability of 1 in 30 per mission. That is roughly 3 times safer than what Apollo accepted, and some would argue it is still not safe enough. In March of 2026, just weeks before Artemis II launched, an independent analysis published by Idle Words estimated the actual crew loss probability for this mission at somewhere between 1 in 2 and 1 in 50, depending on which assumptions you use about the heat shield. 1 in 2, at the pessimistic end, means a coin flip. 1 in 50, at the optimistic end, is still more dangerous than Apollo. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and the honest answer is that nobody knows exactly where, because this spacecraft has never flown with crew at lunar return velocity. The heat shield is the most visible symbol of this tension between caution and urgency. When Orion returned from its uncrewed test flight on Artemis I in November of 2022, the Avcoat ablative heat shield, the material designed to burn away in a controlled fashion to protect the capsule from the roughly 2,760 degrees Celsius of re-entry, behaved unexpectedly. Pieces of the ablative material broke away. They call it char loss and spalling. The material cracked and separated in ways that the models had not predicted. NASA's Office of Inspector General Investigation identified 3 potential ways this could kill a crew: a direct breach in the thermal protection system, debris from the shield striking the parachute risers, and structural damage from uneven heating. NASA's response was not to redesign the heat shield. There was not enough time or budget for that. Instead, they modified the re-entry trajectory, a shallower approach angle, a different skip profile, to reduce the thermal stress on the material. Same shield, different angle, and then they put 4 humans on top of it. In January of 2026, NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman reviewed the analysis, met with engineers and outside experts, and gave the green light to fly. In February, Isaacman went further. He cancelled the planned SLS Block 1-B and Block 2 upgrades entirely, standardizing the program on the current Block 1 configuration. The stated reason was risk reduction and schedule stability, but some read it as an admission that the program could not afford to develop more powerful versions of a rocket that already cost $4 billion per flight. This is what the price of caution looks like. It is not that NASA does not want to move fast. It is that the institutional memory of Challenger and Columbia, 14 crew members lost because risk was normalized, has created a culture where every decision is weighed against the question, Can we defend this if it goes wrong? And that question, applied rigorously enough, slows everything down. Artemis 1 was uncrewed. Artemis 2 is crewed but does not land. Artemis 3 will be the first landing attempt. Each mission is a gate, and the next one does not open until the previous one proves the hardware works. Apollo skipped many of those gates because the geopolitical stakes of losing the moon race were judged to be higher than the human stakes of losing a crew. We made a different choice this time. Whether it is the right choice depends on what happens next. And what happens next, right now, today, is that 4 astronauts are out there, closer to the moon than to the Earth, on a spacecraft that has never carried humans this far before, and despite everything, the congressional compromises, the budget politics, the heat shield questions, what they're doing over the next 6 days is genuinely extraordinary. Because Artemis 2 may not be a landing mission, but it is still a journey unlike anything any human has experienced in 54 years. Let's go with them. Part 3 continued, what Apollo did differently. Before we ride along with the Artemis 2 crew, it is worth pausing on something that gets lost in the political discussion. Because when people ask, if we went to the moon in 1969, why can't we go now? The answer is not that we forgot how. We did not lose the knowledge. We did not lose the engineering capability. What we lost was the architecture, and what we built to replace it was designed for a different purpose. The Saturn V was a monument to focused engineering. Werner von Braun and his team at the Marshall Space Flight Center designed it from scratch, starting with a single question. What do we need to get 3 people to the moon and back? Everything flowed from that question. The first stage, the SIC, generated 7.5 million pounds of thrust from 5 F1 engines, each one burning kerosene and liquid oxygen, each one producing more thrust than all 3 of the Space Shuttle's main engines combined. The second stage, the S2, used 5 J2 engines burning liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. The third stage, the S4B, had a single J2 engine that would restart in orbit to perform the trans-lunar injection burn, the same kind of burn that Orion's CPS performed 3 days ago. The whole stack stood 363 feet tall. It weighed 6.5 million pounds fully fueled, and it could deliver 48,600 kilograms to trans-lunar injection, enough for the command module, the service module, and the lunar module all riding together. 1 rocket, 1 launch, 1 stack. If you had the crew, the capsule, and the lander, you loaded them all on top of the Saturn V, pointed it at the sky, and went to the moon. The elegance was in the integration. Everything the mission needed was on 1 vehicle. Now compare that to SLS. The Space Launch System is not a bad rocket. Let me be clear about that. It generates 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, more than Saturn V. Its RS-25 engines are some of the most tested and reliable liquid-fueled engines ever built. It flew successfully on Artemis 1 in November of 2022, and it flew successfully again 3 days ago with 4 humans aboard. It works. But it was not designed around the question, what do we need to get to the moon? It was designed around the question, what can we build using the hardware and workforce we already have? And those 2 questions produce very different rockets. SLS Block 1 puts 27,000 kilograms into trans-lunar injection. That is enough for Orion and its European service module, and essentially nothing else. No lander, no transfer stage, no additional payload. If you want to land on the moon using SLS, you need a second launch on a completely separate vehicle to send the lander separately. That is why SpaceX's Starship HLS exists in the Artemis architecture. Not because NASA wanted a 2-launch system, but because the rocket Congress gave them cannot do the job in 1. The speed difference is equally stark. From President Kennedy's "We choose to go to the moon" speech in September of 1961 to Neil Armstrong's boot touching the regolith in July of 1969, 7 years and 10 months. 8 years, roughly. During that time, NASA flew 10 crewed missions in the Gemini program, then 10 crewed missions in the Apollo program, 20 crewed flights in 8 years, each one pushing the boundary further. Gemini proved orbital rendezvous and docking. Apollo 7 tested the command module in Earth orbit. Apollo 8 flew to the Moon on the very next flight. December of 1968, just 3 months after the first crewed Apollo mission. Then Apollo 9 tested the lunar module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 did a full dress rehearsal in lunar orbit, and Apollo 11 landed. 6 months from the first lunar flyby to boots on the surface. Artemis was formally announced as a return to Moon directive in 2017. The original target for the first landing was 2024. As of April 2026, 9 years after the program was announced, we have completed 1 uncrewed test flight and 1 crewed flyby. The first landing, Artemis 3, is not expected before September of 2026 at the earliest, and most analysts consider 2027 or 2028 more realistic. That is 10 to 11 years from announcement to first landing compared to Apollo's 8. And the difference is not because the engineers are slower or the technology is worse. The difference is because the political and institutional infrastructure that builds the hardware operates on a fundamentally different tempo than it did in the 1960s. Imagine walking through the Kennedy Space Center grounds today. Pad 39A, where Saturn V launched for Apollo 11 is now a SpaceX launch pad. Pad 39B, right next door, is where SLS launched 3 days ago with the Artemis 2 crew. The pads are less than 2 miles apart, the same flat Florida landscape, the same Atlantic horizon, but between them is half a century of institutional change, from a space agency that could move from concept to moon landing in 8 years, to one that needs a decade to fly a capsule around the moon and bring it back. That is not a criticism of the people. The engineers, the technicians, the astronauts, they are brilliant. They are committed. They work with the architecture they are given, but the architecture was not given to them by mission planners. It was given to them by Congress, and that is the heart of this entire story. All right, enough about the politics. You came here to go to the moon, and the crew of Artemis 2 is already on their way. Let's go with them. Part 4. Leaving Earth. Picture this. It is the evening of April 1st, 2026. The Florida coast is warm, the way it always is in early spring, and the sky over Kennedy Space Center is starting to darken. At Launch Complex 39B, the same pad complex where Saturn V lifted off for Apollo, where the space shuttle launched 135 times, where decades of human ambition left scorch marks on concrete, the Space Launch System stands 212 feet tall under floodlights. It is white and orange and impossibly large, capped by the Orion spacecraft and the Launch Abort System tower that rises above it like a needle. Inside Orion, 4 astronauts are strapped into their seats, Reed Wiseman in the commander's chair, Victor Glover beside him as pilot, Christina Koch and Jeremy Hansen behind them as mission specialists. They have been here for hours. They have run through checklists, confirmed systems, listened to the voices from mission control cycling through the final countdown. Earlier in the day, there were photographs of the crew playing cards while they waited, a small human moment before an inhuman journey. At 6:35 p.m. Eastern Time, the twin-solid rocket boosters ignite. The sound reaches the press site a few seconds later, not a bang but a deep rolling thunder that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. SLS generates 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, more than any rocket currently flying. The ground shakes, car alarms go off miles away, and the rocket rises slowly at first, almost reluctantly, then accelerating as it clears the tower and arcs eastward over the Atlantic. 2 minutes in, the solid boosters separate and fall away, 2 columns of white smoke diverging against the darkening sky. The core stage RS-25 engines continue burning, pushing Orion higher and faster. 8 minutes after launch, the core stage shuts down and separates. Orion, still attached to the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, the ICPS, is in low Earth orbit. Everything so far is nominal. Everything has worked. But they are not going to the moon yet. Not quite. For the next hour and a half or so, Orion circles the Earth while the crew and mission control verify systems. The ICPS is checked. The service module's solar array wings deploy. 4 panels unfolding like the petals of some metallic flower, locking into position and beginning to draw power from the sun. Flight controllers in Houston confirm all 4 wings are functioning. This is one of those small milestones that gets buried in mission updates, but matters enormously. If those arrays do not deploy, the mission is over before it really begins. Then comes the moment that changes everything. The trans-lunar injection burn. The ICPS fires its single RL-10 engine for approximately 5 minutes and 50 seconds. In those 6 minutes, Orion accelerates from roughly 28,000 km per hour, orbital velocity, the speed needed to stay in low Earth orbit, to approximately 39,400 km per hour, escape velocity, the speed needed to break free of the Earth's gravitational hold and coast to the Moon. The crew feels this as sustained acceleration, about 1.2 g for 6 minutes, not crushing, but insistent, like someone pressing you firmly back into your seat and holding you there, and then the engine cuts off, the ICPS separates and drifts away, and Orion is alone. This is the moment of commitment. After TLI, there is no quick way to turn around. The crew is on a free return trajectory, a path that will carry them to the Moon, around the far side, and back to Earth using gravity alone. If everything goes perfectly, they will fine-tune the trajectory with small burns along the way. If everything fails, if the service module engine dies, if the thrusters go silent, if every propulsive system on the spacecraft stops working, the free return trajectory will still bring them home. The Moon's gravity will sling them around and send them back toward Earth like a stone skipping off water. It is the ultimate backup plan, baked into the physics of the trajectory itself. But between here and there is 250,000 miles of empty space, 4 days of coasting, and a silence that grows deeper with every passing hour. The Earth, which filled Orion's windows at launch, begins to shrink. Not fast, you would not notice it minute to minute, but over hours, then days, the change becomes undeniable. That blue sphere, the only home our species has ever known, is getting smaller. And the Moon, still just a bright point of light among the stars, is getting larger. The crew is on a rocket that Congress built, on a trajectory that physics determined, and for the next 10 days, only the physics is keeping them safe. Part 5. The Crew. Before we go further into the void, let's talk about the 4 people making this journey. Because they are not interchangeable figures in pressure suits. They are specific human beings with specific histories, and understanding who they are changes what this mission means. Reed Wiseman is the commander. He is a Navy test pilot, which in the astronaut world is about as foundational a credential as you can have. Test pilots are trained to fly experimental aircraft to their limits, and report back with precision about what worked and what did not. That is literally what he is doing on Artemis 2, flying an experimental spacecraft to its limits for the first time with humans aboard. Wiseman flew to the International Space Station in 2014 aboard a Russian Soyuz capsule, spent 165 days in orbit, and returned. Between 2020 and 2022, he served as NASA's chief astronaut, which means he was the person responsible for evaluating other astronauts' readiness for flight. He decided who was ready to go to space. Now he is in the seat himself, on the most consequential test flight NASA has conducted since the shuttle. Victor Glover is the pilot, also a Navy test pilot. In November of 2020, Glover rode SpaceX's Crew Dragon Resilience to the ISS as part of Crew 1, the first operational crew rotation flight of the Dragon capsule. He spent 167 days on the station. On Artemis 2, Glover becomes the first black astronaut to fly on a lunar mission. Not the first black astronaut in space, that was Guion Bluford, back in 1983, but the first to leave low Earth orbit, the first to see the Moon up close, the first to travel farther from Earth than any person of colour in history. That distinction matters, not because it changes the physics, but because it changes who gets to be part of the story. Christina Koch is Mission Specialist 1. She's an electrical engineer who spent years building space instruments before becoming an astronaut. In March of 2019, Koch launched to the ISS and did not come home until February of 2020. 328 consecutive days in space, the longest single spaceflight by a woman in history. In October of 2019, she and fellow astronaut Jessica Meir conducted the first all-female spacewalk. Koch knows what it is like to live in a tin can in the void for the better part of a year. Her long-duration experience is directly relevant to validating Orion's life support systems. She knows, in her bones, what it feels like when a spacecraft's environmental systems are working and when they are not. And then there is Jeremy Hansen, Mission Specialist 2, Canadian Space Agency, CF-18 fighter pilot, geologist. And here is the thing about Hansen that makes his presence on this mission quietly remarkable. Artemis 2 is his first spaceflight. He has never been to space before, his first time leaving the planet, and he is going to the moon. Not low Earth orbit, not the ISS, the moon. He will be the first Canadian to travel beyond low Earth orbit, the first Canadian to see the far side of the moon with his own eyes, and he is doing it as a rookie. Think about what that means for a moment. Hansen has trained for years. He has spent time in simulators, in underwater analogues, in centrifuges that press 6 times his body weight against his chest. But until April 1st, 2026, he had never felt a launch, never experienced microgravity, never looked out a window and seen the curve of the Earth. His first experience of all of that is happening on a mission that will take him farther from home than 99.9999% of all humans who have ever lived. As of today, April 4th, 2026, the crew is on flight day 4. They are closer to the moon than they are to Earth. The latest updates from Mission Control say they are in good spirits, preparing the cabin for the lunar observation period that begins when they reach the moon on April 6th. They have been exercising, running medical response drills, testing the emergency communication system in deep space. They did a CPR demonstration earlier, and last night there was a minor incident that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. The crew reported a burning smell coming from Orion's toilet. Flight controllers traced it to orange insulation on the hygiene bay door. Not a crisis, not even really a problem, but it is the kind of detail that reminds you these are real humans in a real spacecraft dealing with real, mundane annoyances, even while hurtling through the void at thousands of kilometers per hour toward the moon. The dynamic between these 4 people matters more than it might seem. Astronaut crew selection is not random. NASA psychologists evaluate personality compatibility, stress responses, communication styles, and leadership dynamics. A crew that does not mesh can compromise a mission. For Artemis 2, the composition tells a story of deliberate balance. 2 pilots, 2 mission specialists, 3 Americans, 1 Canadian, 3 veterans, 1 rookie, 2 military test pilots, 1 engineer scientist, 1 geologist fighter pilot. The ages range from mid-40s to early 50s. Every one of them has been training together for over 3 years, since the crew was announced in April of 2023. In the confined space of Orion, a cabin roughly the volume of a minivan, if you took out the seats and equipment, 4 adults live, work, eat, sleep, and use a single toilet for 10 days. There is no privacy. There is no separate room. There is no going outside for a walk when the walls start closing in. Every conversation is heard by everyone. Every meal is shared. Every sleep cycle is communal, with sleeping bags mounted to the walls inches from each other. This is not the ISS, where crew members have individual sleeping quarters, a dedicated dining area, multiple modules to spread out in, and a cupola where you can float alone and watch the Earth roll by beneath you. Orion is a test capsule. It is designed to get crew to the moon and back, not to provide comfort. The interior is packed with equipment, racks of avionics, stowage compartments, experiment hardware, and the consumables that keep 4 humans alive for 10 days. Free-floating space is limited. You learn very quickly to move carefully, to stow everything immediately after use, to choreograph your movements with your crewmates so 2 people are not trying to occupy the same cubic meter at the same time. This is where Coke's long-duration ISS experience becomes invaluable. She knows from nearly a year in space how interpersonal friction builds in confined environments. She knows how important routine is. She knows that small courtesies, cleaning up after yourself, keeping shared spaces organised, giving someone space when they need it, are not luxuries in a spacecraft. They are survival strategies. Hansen, the rookie, is learning all of this for the first time under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Not in low Earth orbit where you can see the Earth filling the window and know that rescue is a few hours away, but in deep space where the Earth is a shrinking marble and the Moon is growing larger every day. The crew exercises twice a day, not because they enjoy it. The resistance bands and isometric protocols are repetitive and unpleasant in microgravity, but because the alternative is measurable physical degradation. Bone density loss begins within the first few days of microgravity exposure. Muscle atrophy follows. The heart, no longer working against gravity, begins to decondition, shrinking slightly, becoming less efficient at pumping blood. 10 days is not long enough for these effects to become serious, but Orion's life support data will provide NASA with baseline physiological measurements for future, longer missions. The crew is wearing biomedical sensors that track heart rate, blood oxygen, sleep quality, and radiation dose in real time. Every heartbeat, every breath, every hour of sleep is data. These 4 people are not just crew, they are test subjects. These are not passengers. These are test pilots flying an experimental vehicle to the Moon for the first time. 4 humans, farther from home than anyone in 54 years, on a spacecraft that was never designed to land them where they are going. And in 2 days, they will fly behind the Moon and lose all contact with Earth. That part of the journey, the silence, is what we need to talk about next. Part 6. The silence of deep space. There is a moment, somewhere around the 2nd day of the coast to the Moon, when something changes. It is not a single event you can point to. No alarm goes off. No system activates. It is a gradual realization, the kind that creeps in when the routine settles and the adrenaline of launch fades. The Earth is smaller now, noticeably smaller. It no longer fills the window. It sits in the window, framed by black, a marble of blue and white swirled with cloud patterns that shift hour by hour. You can cover it with your thumb if you hold your hand out at arm's length. And the stars, which were washed out by Earth's reflected light during the first day, are becoming more vivid, more present. The Milky Way is not a faint smudge anymore. It is a river of light that arcs across the viewport with a clarity that no one on the surface of Earth ever gets to see. The Moon is growing, still distant, but it is no longer a dot. It has become a disk. You can start to make out features, the dark splotches of the Maria, the brighter cratered highlands. It does not look like a destination yet. It looks like a painting, something unreal and impossibly still, hanging in a sky that has no up or down. Inside Orion, the crew floats. Microgravity has been the baseline since the TLI burn ended, and by day 2 or 3 the body begins to adapt. Fluids shift upward, faces puff slightly, sinuses feel congested, the head feels full in a way that never quite resolves. The crew eats pre-packaged meals, exercises against elastic resistance bands to keep muscles from atrophying, runs system checks, and talks to Houston. But the conversations with Houston are different now, not in content, but in rhythm. At lunar distance, a radio signal travelling at the speed of light takes approximately 1.3 seconds to reach Earth. That means a 2.6 second round-trip delay. It does not sound like much, but try having a conversation where every response arrives almost 3 seconds after you finish speaking. The natural rhythm of human dialogue, the interruptions, the overlapping words, the immediate feedback, breaks down completely. You say something, then wait. Then the other person says something, but by the time you hear it, you have already started your next thought. Apollo crews noted this disorientation. It is subtle, but it compounds over days, and it gets worse as the distance increases on the outbound leg. Now add this. For the majority of the transit, the crew is outside Earth's magnetosphere. The magnetic field that deflects charged particles and shields the ISS and everything in low Earth orbit does not extend to the Moon. Once past the Van Allen radiation belts, which Orion traverses in the first several hours after TLI, the crew is exposed to the full deep space radiation environment. Galactic cosmic rays, or GCRs, are the baseline. These are high-energy particles, protons, alpha particles, and heavier atomic nuclei accelerated to enormous speeds by supernovae and other violent events across the galaxy. They come from every direction, and they pass through the walls of the spacecraft like the walls are not there. You cannot feel them, you cannot see them, but they are passing through the crew's bodies constantly, occasionally striking a strand of DNA, occasionally depositing enough energy to damage a cell. Over a 10-day mission, the cumulative dose from GCRs alone is modest. But it is non-zero, and it is an exposure that no human has experienced since the last Apollo crew came home in December of 1972. The bigger risk is a solar particle event, an SPE. The sun erupts. A coronal mass ejection hurls billions of tons of magnetized plasma into space. If that eruption happens to be pointed at the Moon, or at the corridor between the Earth and the Moon, the crew could be hit by a wave of high-energy protons that arrives within minutes to hours. We talked about this in detail when we covered how hostile the Moon really is. The near miss in August of 1972 between the Apollo 16 and 17 missions produced an estimated 2,600 rem of unshielded radiation dose. That is enough to cause acute radiation sickness, organ failure, and death, all within days. Had astronauts been on the lunar surface during that event, they almost certainly would not have survived. Artemis 2 is flying during solar maximum, the peak of solar cycle 25, which has been running higher and more active than many forecasts predicted. The probability of a significant SPE during the 10-day mission window is not negligible. Orion carries a radiation shelter protocol. If a major event is detected by solar monitoring systems, the crew is instructed to move to the center of the spacecraft, surround themselves with water containers and equipment bags, and wait it out. This is not a radiation vault. There is no lead-lined chamber inside Orion. It is a damage reduction measure. The mass of the supplies absorbs some of the incoming particles and reduces the dose. It is the best they can do with the spacecraft they have. The strangest thing about deep space travel is how quiet it is. Not silence in the literal sense. Inside Orion, the fans run constantly, circulating air through the carbon dioxide scrubbers. The environmental control system hums, pumps cycle coolant through the spacecraft's thermal regulation loops. There is always mechanical noise, but outside, beyond the thin aluminum and composite walls of the capsule, there is nothing. No wind, no friction, no sound of engines because the engines are off. After the TLI burn, Orion coasts. It is moving at tremendous speed, thousands of kilometers per hour, but with nothing to push against, there is no sensation of movement. Einstein's equivalence principle in action. In a spacecraft coasting through free space, there is no way to distinguish between floating in zero gravity and being at rest. The crew feels weightless. The spacecraft feels still. And the only evidence that they are moving comes from looking out the window and watching the Earth get smaller, the Moon get larger, and the stars wheel slowly overhead as the spacecraft rotates in its barbecue roll. A slow axial spin designed to distribute solar heating evenly across the hull. That barbecue roll, by the way, creates something strange in the cabin. Because the spacecraft is rotating, the sun passes across the windows periodically. Light, then shadow. Light, then shadow. A slow rhythm that Apollo crews described as oddly hypnotic. On the sunlit side, surface is warm. On the shadowed side, they cool. The thermal gradient across the spacecraft can be significant, space-facing surfaces dropping toward minus 150 degrees Celsius, sun-facing surfaces climbing toward positive 150, and the roll keeps any single surface from overheating or freezing. It is a simple, elegant solution to a fundamental problem of spaceflight. You are simultaneously being baked and frozen, and the only thing protecting you is a slow spin and a few layers of insulation. For the crew, the days in deep space have a rhythm shaped by the mission timeline and by Houston. Wake-up calls come at scheduled times. Exercise periods are mandatory. Without resistance training, muscles begin to atrophy within days in microgravity, and bone density begins to decrease within weeks. The crew uses elastic resistance bands and isometric exercises, nothing like the sophisticated exercise equipment aboard the ISS, because Orion is not designed for long-duration habitation. It is designed for 10 days. Get there, do the job, come home. Meals are pre-packaged, thermostabilized pouches and freeze-dried packets that are reconstituted with water from the fuel cells. There is no kitchen, no heating element beyond a water dispenser that provides warm water for rehydration. The food is functional, not pleasant. Apollo astronauts describe the food as tolerable at best. Artemis II's provisions are better than Apollo's, but no one is confusing Orion's galley with a restaurant. Sleep is scheduled but not easy. In microgravity, your body does not settle into a mattress. You float. The crew uses sleeping bags secured to the cabin walls, zipped in to keep from drifting. Without the familiar pull of gravity, the sensation of lying down does not exist. Some astronauts love it, describe it as the most comfortable sleep of their lives, floating in a warm cocoon. Others find it deeply disorienting, as if they are falling endlessly, never landing. Coke, with her 328 days on the ISS, knows the feeling well. For Hansen, it is brand new. And through it all, the communication delay is growing. Every hour the Earth is farther away. Every hour the round-trip delay between speaking and hearing a response gets a fraction of a second longer. By the time the crew reaches the moon, Houston's voice will arrive with a noticeable lag. Not enough to break communication entirely, but enough to make every exchange feel slightly disconnected. Every question takes a beat too long to get an answer. Every urgent call is delayed by the speed of light, and when the crew swings behind the moon, even that delayed connection disappears completely. And every kilometre the crew travels takes them farther from any help. If something goes wrong, a medical emergency, a system failure, a solar storm, there is no rescue mission. No second spacecraft is coming. The nearest hospital is 250,000 miles behind them, and it is getting farther away every minute. The free return trajectory is their safety net, but it is a passive one. It does not solve problems. It just ensures that the moon's gravity will fling them back toward Earth, even if every engine on the spacecraft fails. That is the reality of deep space travel. It is not just distance. It is isolation on a scale that human beings have not evolved to comprehend. And the deepest moment of that isolation, the moment when it becomes total, is coming up on April 6th, when Orion swings behind the moon and the last thread of communication with Earth goes silent. Part 7. The Far Side. On or around April 6th, 2026, roughly 5 days after launch, Orion will reach the moon, and what happens next is the part of this mission that will stay with these 4 astronauts for the rest of their lives. The spacecraft approaches the moon from behind, coming around the far side on a trajectory that will carry it to within approximately 7,400 kilometers of the surface. Some trajectory profiles suggest the closest approach could be as little as 6,400 kilometers, depending on navigation burns during the coast phase. Either way, the crew will be closer to the moon than at any other point in the mission. Close enough to see individual craters. Close enough that the surface fills the lower half of their field of view, and it is the far side of the moon, the hemisphere that never faces Earth. As Orion passes behind the moon, the spacecraft will lose all contact with our planet, This is not a technical failure, it is physics. The moon is 3,474 kilometers in diameter, a wall of rock that physically blocks every radio frequency, every data link, every voice transmission between the spacecraft and Earth. For approximately 45 minutes, the crew of Artemis 2 will be completely, utterly alone. No voice from Houston, no telemetry flowing back to mission control, no ability to call for help, and no ability for anyone on Earth to reach them. The silence is total. Only 24 humans in history have experienced this. The crews of Apollo 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. They flew behind the moon and lost contact with Earth and came back to tell about it. The Apollo 8 crew, in December of 1968, were the first. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders orbited the moon 10 times, passing behind it 10 times, losing communication 10 times. Each pass lasted about 45 minutes. Each time, for 3/4 of an hour, they were more alone than any human being had ever been. When Wiseman, Glover, Koch, and Hansen swing behind the moon on April 6th, they will become humans 25 through 28 to see the far side with their own eyes. And what they see will look nothing like the moon you know. The near side of the moon, the face we see from Earth every night, is defined by the Maria. Those dark, smooth patches that give the man in the moon its shape are ancient lava plains, the remains of volcanic eruptions that flooded enormous impact basins billions of years ago. Maria cover roughly 31% of the near side. They are the moon's most recognizable features. The far side has almost none. Maria cover approximately 1.6% of the far side surface. Instead, what you see from orbit is a landscape of overwhelming, relentless cratering. Craters on top of craters on top of craters, layer upon layer of impacts accumulated over 4 billion years, with no volcanic floods to smooth them over. The surface is brighter than the near side. The highland material is lighter in colour than the dark volcanic basalt, and it gives the far side an alien quality that photographs do not fully capture. From 7,000 kilometres up, it will look like a world that has been hit by everything the solar system could throw at it, and simply endured. The dominant feature is the South Pole Aitken Basin. If you watched our deep dive into what the far side is hiding, and if you have not, I would highly recommend going back to that one. You know about this. The SPA Basin is 2,500 kilometres across and roughly 8 to 12 kilometres deep. It is the largest confirmed impact structure in the entire solar system. Something enormous hit the moon approximately 4.3 billion years ago, punching a hole so catastrophic that it should have exposed the mantle beneath the crust. And yet, and this is one of the great unsolved mysteries of lunar science, the expected mantle material is missing. The floor of the basin is not what models predict it should be. Buried beneath that floor, detected by the Grail spacecraft's gravity mapping, is a mass anomaly, a concentration of dense material weighing approximately 2.18 times 10 to the 16th kilograms. That is roughly 2.4 quintillion kilograms of metal, buried beneath the surface of the basin. The leading explanation from a 2019 study by James and colleagues at Baylor University is that it is the metallic core of the impactor that created the basin, a piece of the asteroid or protoplanetary body that hit the moon 4 billion years ago, still embedded in the mantle like a bullet lodged in bone. Some corners of the internet have suggested it is something else. It is almost certainly not something else. But the fact that we are still debating exactly what is buried under the largest impact scar in the solar system tells you something about how little we understand the moon, even now. For the crew inside Orion, this passage over the far side will last roughly 45 minutes. 45 minutes of total isolation. No voice from Houston, no data link, no ability to pull up a text message or check an email or hear another human voice that is not inside the capsule. The 4 of them, and only them, for 3/4 of an hour. What does that silence feel like? The Apollo crews left some clues. Michael Collins, who orbited the Moon alone in the command module while Armstrong and Aldrin walked on the surface during Apollo 11, described his far-side passes as the most profound moments of his life. Not the loneliest, Collins always pushed back against that characterization, but the most clarifying. On the far side, with Earth hidden and the surface of an ancient world rolling past below, the normal hierarchies of importance, career, ambition, national pride, seemed to flatten. What remained was simpler. The universe is large. You're small, and you're seeing something almost no one has ever seen. Jim Lovell, who flew behind the Moon twice, once on Apollo 8 and once on the nearly fatal Apollo 13, described the far-side silence as not frightening but absolute. He said the absence of communication with Earth did not feel like abandonment. It felt like concentration, as if the universe had cleared the room so you could pay attention to what was in front of you. For the crew of Artemis II, the far-side passage adds a modern dimension that Apollo lacked. These 4 astronauts have spent their entire adult lives connected. Phones, email, mission loops, social media, family group chats. They are the most connected generation of astronauts ever to fly. And for 45 minutes, all of that stops. Not because a network goes down, because a world gets in the way. 3,474 kilometers of rock, the physical body of the Moon, stands between them and every other human being alive. There is no workaround, no satellite relay, no backup channel. The laws of physics enforce the silence, and no amount of technology can override them. In that silence, flying over the ancient, battered, waterless far side at 7,400 kilometers altitude, seeing craters that have not changed in 3 billion years, feeling the absence of Earth in every window, something shifts. We do not yet know what that shift will feel like for this crew, but every Apollo astronaut who experienced it said the same thing in different words. It changes you. You leave Earth as a pilot or an engineer or a scientist. You come back as something else, someone who has seen the overview, someone who knows, not intellectually but physically, that humanity lives on a very thin surface of a very small world in a very large and very quiet universe. That is what Artemis II is delivering, even without a landing. Not just data, not just engineering validation, but the experience of perspective, the rarest thing any human being can receive. And it is happening right now to 4 people on a spacecraft that Congress built. The crew of Artemis II will fly over this basin. They will see it with their own eyes. They will take high-resolution photographs and record their own observations. And they will do all of this in total silence from Earth, with no one to call if something goes wrong, staring down at a surface that holds mysteries we have not yet solved. Imagine that for a moment. You're floating in a spacecraft roughly the size of a large SUV. The Earth is gone. It is behind the Moon, hidden. There is no blue marble in any window, just the lunar surface below and the stars above. The surface is grey and white, pockmarked, ancient, illuminated by sunlight with no atmosphere to soften it. Pure black shadows and blinding white highlights, with no gradient in between. You're seeing something that only 24 other humans have ever seen. The silence in the cabin is broken only by the hum of the life support system, the occasional click of an instrument, and the sound of your own breathing. Mission control is not there. Your family is not there. The entire human race is behind a wall of rock 3,474 kilometers thick. For 45 minutes, you are the farthest thing from home that exists. And then, as the trajectory carries Orion around the curve of the far side, something begins to appear at the edge of the window, a sliver of blue, a crescent of light against the grey lunar horizon. The Earth is rising, and in that moment, that specific, unrepeatable moment, you see what only a handful of humans have ever seen. Your planet, your home, emerging from behind another world. We will come back to that image later, because it may be the most important thing this mission produces. But first, the crew has to get home, and getting home is the most dangerous part of the journey. Part 8. coming home at 40,000 kilometers per hour. After the lunar flyby, Orion begins the coast back to Earth. The free return trajectory is doing its work. The moon's gravity has redirected the spacecraft, and it is now falling back toward home. Over the next 4 to 5 days, the crew will watch the moon shrink behind them and the Earth grow ahead of them. The dynamic reverses. Earth goes from a small blue crescent at the edge of the window to a growing disk that eventually fills the viewport. The journey out was marked by diminishment, home getting smaller. The journey back is marked by approach, home getting larger. And somewhere in those final hours, the crew has to prepare for the most violent phase of the entire mission. Re-entry. Orion will hit Earth's atmosphere at approximately 40,000 kilometers per hour. That is roughly 11 kilometers per second, Mach 32. To put that in perspective, a bullet fired from a high-powered rifle travels at about 1 kilometer per second. Orion is coming in at 11 times that speed. A commercial airliner cruises at about 900 kilometers per hour. Orion will be moving more than 44 times faster than a jet. This is the fastest re-entry speed any crewed vehicle has ever attempted with humans aboard, and it is significantly faster than the roughly 28,000 kilometers per hour that spacecraft returning from the ISS experience. This is not a routine re-entry from low Earth orbit. This is lunar return velocity, and the physics are unforgiving. To manage the thermal load and the G-forces, Orion uses a technique called skip re-entry. Instead of plunging straight into the atmosphere and decelerating in one continuous descent, the capsule takes a more controlled approach. It dips into the upper atmosphere at a shallow angle, bleeding off some speed. The heat builds. The friction between the capsule and the air generates a sheath of plasma around the vehicle, ionized gas so hot that it glows. The exterior of the AV coat heat shield reaches temperatures of approximately 2,760 degrees Celsius. That is hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to melt titanium. The crew sits meters away from that inferno, separated by the thickness of the heat shield and the structure of the capsule. After the first dip, Orion skips back up, rises briefly out of the dense atmosphere, like a stone skipping across a pond. This pause gives the heat shield a moment to cool, gives the crew a brief reduction in G-loading, and allows mission control to fine-tune the trajectory for the second entry. Then the capsule plunges back in for the final descent. The G-forces build from the weightlessness of deep space to 4, 5, possibly 6 times the force of gravity. After 10 days of floating, the crew's bodies are suddenly pressed hard into their seats. Blood pools in their legs. Vision narrows. Breathing becomes effortful. This transition from 0G to high G is one of the most physiologically stressful things a human body can experience, and it happens in minutes. During the plasma phase, communications black out again. The ionized gas surrounding the capsule blocks radio signals, just as the moon blocked them during the Farside flyby. For several minutes, mission control hears nothing. The crew hears nothing from Earth. They are wrapped in a cocoon of superheated plasma, decelerating at enormous forces and completely alone. Again. This is a different kind of silence from the Farside blackout. The Farside silence was peaceful, contemplative, a silence of distance. This silence is violent. The spacecraft is shaking. The heat shield is ablating, material burning away by design, carrying thermal energy away from the capsule. And the question that has hung over this entire program, will the heat shield hold, is being answered in real time. This is where the Artemis 1 anomaly becomes viscerally relevant. On that uncrewed test flight in November of 2022, the AV coat heat shield experienced char loss and spalling. Pieces of the ablative material cracked and broke away in patterns that the models had not predicted. The investigation determined that trapped gases inside the AV coat material could not escape fast enough, causing pressure buildup and fracturing. NASA did not redesign the shield. They modified the re-entry trajectory instead, changed the angles, adjusted the skip profile to reduce peak heating. Same material, different approach. And the crew of Artemis 2 is the first test of whether that fix works. We covered the heat shield issue in detail in our video on the worst-case scenarios for this mission. The 3 crew kill mechanisms identified by the Inspector General, direct thermal breach, debris striking the parachute risers, and structural failure from uneven heating, are all scenarios that would manifest during exactly this phase of the mission. Exactly this phase. The phase happening right now, above the Pacific Ocean, with 4 humans inside. The parachute deployment sequence is itself a choreographed series of events that has to work perfectly. At roughly 24,000 feet altitude, 2 drogue parachutes deploy first, smaller chutes that stabilize the capsule and slow it from several hundred miles per hour to a more manageable descent rate. The drogues hold for about a minute, orienting Orion into the proper attitude for main chute deployment. Then the drogue mortars fire, pulling the 3 pilot parachutes out, which in turn extract the 3 enormous main parachutes. Each main parachute is 116 feet in diameter when fully open, roughly the size of a football field if you could flatten all 3 of them out. They open in a stage sequence called reefing, where the canopy inflates partially at first, then fully, to prevent the shock of full deployment from tearing the fabric or snapping the risers. The opening loads are enormous, tens of thousands of pounds of force transmitted through the suspension lines to the spacecraft, and this system has to work. All of it. Orion's parachute system is designed to be survivable with 2 of 3 main chutes. If one fails, the landing is harder but survivable. If 2 fail, the situation becomes critical. The Artemis 1 heat shield anomaly, the char loss and spalling, is directly relevant here, and not just because of the thermal breach risk. One of the 3 crew kill mechanisms identified by the Inspector General was debris from the ablating shield striking the parachute risers during descent. If pieces of AV coat break off during the re-entry burn and tumble along the spacecraft's wake, they could potentially impact the parachute deployment system. A severed riser means a failed chute. 2 severed risers means 2 failed chutes. The modified re-entry trajectory is designed in part to reduce this risk by lowering the peak heating and therefore reducing the amount of material that ablates away. But it is a risk that exists, and it is a risk that will be resolved in real time during the descent. Below the parachutes, the Pacific Ocean is waiting. The splashdown zone is off the coast of San Diego, selected for calm seas, proximity to naval recovery assets, and favourable weather patterns in early April. The USS Portland, a San Antonio-class amphibious transport dock, is positioned in the recovery zone along with smaller support vessels, helicopters and dive teams. The ship has practiced this recovery dozens of times using mock-ups and training capsules. When Orion touches down, the impact is absorbed partially by the capsule structure and partially by crushable ribs built into the heat shield, designed to deform on impact, dissipating energy the way a car's crumple zone does. After splashdown, the capsule bobs in the swells, oriented with the heat shield down. The crew is inside, waiting. Recovery swimmers from the Navy approach in rigid hull inflatable boats, attach a collar around the capsule to stabilize it, verify that the exterior is safe, and begin the process of opening the hatch. The first thing the crew will feel when the hatch opens is wind, salt air, the smell of the ocean. After 10 days of recycled atmosphere inside Orion, air scrubbed of CO2, filtered, temperature-controlled and utterly sterile, the sensory shock of fresh ocean air will be enormous. Then they are out, lifted by basket into a helicopter, or walked across a ramp onto the recovery ship, depending on their physical condition. Medical teams are standing by. The crew has been in microgravity for 10 days, not long enough for severe deconditioning, but long enough that standing upright in full Earth gravity feels heavy, awkward, like wearing a lead suit. Their vestibular systems are recalibrating. Their legs, unused to bearing weight, feel uncertain. Koch, who readapted after 328 days in space, knows this feeling. For Hansen, it is another first. And at that moment, standing on the deck of a Navy ship blinking in the Pacific sun, legs wobbling, ears ringing with the sound of helicopters and cheering crew members, the mission is over. Artemis 2 is complete. The first crewed voyage to the moon in more than half a century has ended. The spacecraft worked. The crew is alive. And the data from every sensor, every biomedical reading, every thermal measurement from that heat shield begins flowing to the teams who will decide whether Artemis 3 can fly. And then it ends. The plasma fades. The G-forces ease. The drogue parachutes deploy at high altitude, stabilizing the capsule. Then the three main parachutes open, enormous canopies of orange and white that bloom above Orion and slow it from hundreds of kilometers per hour to a gentle descent rate. The spacecraft sways beneath the parachutes, drifting toward the Pacific Ocean off the coast of San Diego, where a Navy recovery ship is waiting. There is a jolt at splashdown, the capsule hitting the water, bobbing, stabilizing. Recovery divers approach, hatches open, and 4 humans who were circling the moon a week ago are back on Earth. When they step out of that capsule, they will hold records. Christina Koch will be the first woman to have travelled beyond low Earth orbit. Victor Glover will be the first black astronaut to have flown on a lunar mission. Jeremy Hansen will be the first Canadian to have travelled beyond low Earth orbit, and he will have done it on his very first spaceflight. Reed Wiseman will be the oldest person to have made this journey, and all 4 of them will have survived the fastest crewed re-entry in history. Those are the records. But the mission will also have answered a question that no amount of testing and modelling could answer. Does this spacecraft work with humans inside it? And does the heat shield hold when lives are on the line? The answer to that question determines whether Artemis 3, the first landing attempt, can proceed. It determines whether 4 more astronauts can ride Orion to lunar orbit, transfer to Starship HLS, descend to the surface, and become the first humans to walk on the moon since Gene Cernan in December of 1972. Everything depends on what happens during that re-entry, and that brings us to the question that has been building behind this entire video, the question that nobody at NASA is eager to answer in public. Part 9. Built to land or built to survive Congress? Here is the question. It is not polite, and it is not comfortable, but it is the one that matters most. Is the Artemis program designed to land humans on the moon, or is it designed to survive the next budget cycle? Because those are not the same thing, and if you look at the architecture, really look at it, stripped of the press conferences and the patriotic music and the slow-motion launch footage, the answer is not as obvious as NASA would like it to be. Let's lay out the 2 honest interpretations because both of them are supported by the data and both of them can be true at the same time. The first interpretation is generous and it is legitimate. Artemis 2 is doing exactly what a responsible test program should do. You do not risk crew on an untested lander. You prove the crew vehicle first, step by step, building confidence with each flight. The fact that it has taken this long, 9 years from the program's formal announcement in 2017 to the first crewed flight, reflects dysfunction in NASA's funding and procurement system, not a failure of engineering. The engineers at NASA, at Lockheed Martin, at the European Space Agency, at the Canadian Space Agency, built a spacecraft that works. SLS launched. Orion flew to the moon and back, uncrewed, and survived re-entry. Now it is flying with crew. Each mission is a proof of concept, a stepping stone to the next. That is how you build a sustainable program, when the stakes of failure include not just dead astronauts, but the death of the program itself. And this mission is genuinely historic. 4 humans are travelling to the moon for the first time in more than half a century. The crew is more diverse than any deep space crew in history. The first woman beyond low Earth orbit, the first black astronaut on a lunar mission, the first Canadian, a rookie making his first flight all the way to the moon. The wonder is real. The achievement is real. The emotional weight of humans returning to the moon, even without landing, is real. Dismissing that because the architecture is imperfect is cynical in a way that serves no one. That is interpretation 1, and I believe it. But I also believe interpretation 2, and interpretation 2 keeps me up at night. At $4.1 billion per flight, With a maximum cadence of roughly one launch per year, SLS is on a political ticking clock. Every year that passes is another $4 billion that Congress has to authorize, appropriate, and defend to constituents. And here is what has changed since SLS was designed. SpaceX exists. Starship exists. It is not fully operational yet. The orbital refueling system that Artemis depends on is still unproven, and Starship's development path has been littered with explosions and delays. But if SpaceX achieves routine Starship operations, the economics of lunar access change completely. Starship is designed to be fully reusable. Its projected per-launch cost, once operations are routine, is a fraction of what SLS costs for a single expendable flight. A single Starship could theoretically carry both crew and landing capability to the Moon, the way Saturn V did, without needing a second vehicle, without needing 10 to 16 refueling flights, without needing the entire Rube Goldberg architecture that Artemis currently requires. The question is not whether Starship will eventually work. The question is whether it will work soon enough to make SLS obsolete before Artemis reaches its goal. And if it does, the political case for continuing to spend $4 billion per year on an expendable rocket designed by a 2010 congressional act becomes very difficult to sustain. We have been here before. In 2004, NASA announced the Constellation program to return to the Moon by 2020. Constellation included a new crew capsule, Orion, a new heavy-lift rocket, Ares 5, and a new lunar lander, Altair. By 2010, the program had spent $9 billion. A review panel concluded it was over budget and behind schedule. President Obama cancelled it. $9 billion. Gone. The lander, gone. The rocket, gone. Only Orion survived, absorbed into what eventually became the Artemis program. Could Artemis follow the same path? The uncomfortable answer is yes. Not because the engineering is bad, SLS works, Orion works, but because the cost structure may be unsustainable. In February of 2026, just weeks before Artemis II launched, Administrator Isaacman cancelled the SLS Block 1B and Block 2 upgrades. Those were the more powerful versions of SLS that would have been needed for later Artemis missions, particularly those involving larger payloads and more complex orbital operations. The official explanation was risk reduction. Standardize on what works. Stop developing what is not ready. But the subtext was hard to miss. The program cannot afford to keep developing a rocket that costs this much per flight. The same month, the One Big Beautiful Bill, a congressional spending package, included $4.1 billion earmarked for SLS rockets for Artemis IV and Artemis V, with mandated minimum spending of $1.025 billion per year from fiscal year 2026 through 2029. Congress is funding Artemis, for now. But funding a program $4 billion at a time, one flight at a time, is not the same as being committed to it. It is life support. It keeps the patient alive for the next cycle without addressing the underlying condition. And then there is the competition. China's lunar program is advancing on a timeline that many Western analysts consider credible. The Chinese National Space Administration has stated a goal of a crewed lunar landing by 2030. Their architecture does not depend on a single $4 billion rocket. They are building incrementally, using smaller launch vehicles, developing their own orbital rendezvous and docking capabilities, and they have already demonstrated far-side operations with Chang'e 4 and sample return with Chang'e 6. If China lands astronauts on the Moon before the United States lands Artemis 3 astronauts, the political fallout will be significant. Not because it changes the physics of lunar exploration, but because it changes the narrative. And in Washington, narrative is everything. There is another dimension to the sustainability question that does not get enough attention, and it is not about money or politics. It is about cadence. Spaceflight programs survive on momentum. The Apollo program succeeded in part because it flew constantly. If one mission revealed a problem, the next mission was already being assembled, and the fix was incorporated in weeks, not years. SLS cannot do this. At one flight per year, there is no rapid iteration. A problem discovered on Artemis 2 will not be tested again until Artemis 3, which is at least a year away and probably more. The heat shield data from this re-entry will be analysed for months before anyone decides whether the fix holds. If it does not hold, if the modified trajectory proves insufficient and the AVCOAT still spools in unpredictable ways, the program faces a choice between redesigning the heat shield, which could take years and cost billions, or accepting the risk, which means putting more crew on a shield that has failed twice. Apollo iterated. SLS endures. Those are different philosophies, and they produce different outcomes. Apollo's rapid iteration caught problems early and fixed them fast. SLS's slow cadence means that every mission is a bottleneck, a single point of success or failure for the entire program. If Artemis 2 encounters a serious anomaly, the program could be grounded for years. There is no Artemis 2B waiting in the wings. And this is where the institutional memory of Constellation becomes relevant. Constellation was cancelled not because it failed catastrophically, but because it was too slow and too expensive relative to expectations. The reviews that killed it did not say the hardware was broken. They said the timeline was unrealistic and the budget was insufficient. Artemis is facing a version of the same challenge. The hardware works, but the pace and cost of the program create a political vulnerability that could be exploited by any administration looking for budget savings or any Congress looking to redirect funding. The most important thing Artemis 2 can do for the program's survival is not set records or take photographs. It is demonstrate that the incremental approach works, that each flight builds on the last, that the risk decreases, that the architecture converges toward a landing. If the data from this mission is clean, if the heat shield performs within limits, if the life support and navigation and communication systems all check out, then Artemis 3 becomes politically defensible. If there are anomalies, even minor ones, the critics will have ammunition. That is the pressure these 4 astronauts carry whether they think about it or not. They are not just testing a spacecraft. They are testing whether the political system that built it can sustain it long enough to deliver on its promise. Now let me address the other question that always comes up when we talk about why Artemis is not landing. Some people, and you see this in comment sections, in forums, in the darker corners of the internet, believe the delay is not political or financial. They believe we are not landing because somebody knows something about the moon that the public does not. Let's be clear about this. The conspiracy theory that we never landed on the moon in the first place is wrong. Period. Every piece of alleged evidence has been debunked so thoroughly and so many times that relitigating it here would be a waste of your time. We went. We left equipment on the surface that is still there. Retroreflectors that scientists bounce lasers off every single day. We brought back 842 pounds of lunar rock that have been independently analysed by laboratories in dozens of countries. We went. The more sophisticated version of this conspiracy, the one that has gained traction in space enthusiast communities, is that SLS is a scam, a jobs program disguised as a moon program, a mechanism for funneling taxpayer money to defence contractors through congressional districts. And honestly, parts of this are not wrong. SLS does cost $4.1 billion per flight. The program does preserve shuttle-era contractors and workforce. The 2010 Authorization Act did constrain NASA's design choices in ways that prioritised workforce preservation over mission capability. But calling it a scam overstates the case. SLS is a real rocket. It really flies. It is currently the only operational vehicle that can send crew to the moon. The more accurate framing is not that SLS is a scam. It is that SLS is the product of a system that optimizes for political sustainability rather than engineering efficiency. And in that system, the cost is a feature, not a bug. $4 billion per flight means $4 billion per year, flowing to facilities in Utah, Louisiana, Alabama, and Florida. That is not waste. It is the price of the political coalition that keeps the program alive. And then there is the far fringe theory, that they are not landing because they discovered something on the moon. Usually this connects to the South Pole Aitken Basin mass anomaly, the 2.18 times 10 to the 16th kilogram metallic concentration buried beneath the basin floor, detected by Grail and published by James and colleagues in 2019. We explored that mass in detail in our video on what the far side is hiding. It is almost certainly the remnant core of the impactor that created the basin 4 billion years ago, a chunk of iron and nickel lodged in the lunar mantle. It is not a structure. It is not artificial. It is geology. The real reason for the delay is the one we have been discussing for the last hour. The lander is not ready. The architecture was designed by Congress, and the risk calculus has changed. But here is what makes the political question so urgent. Every month that Artemis takes is another month that the program's critics have to argue it should be cancelled. Every budget cycle is another opportunity for a new administration, a new congressional majority, a new set of priorities to look at the $4 billion line item and ask, why are we doing this when Starship might do it cheaper? Constellation lasted 6 years before it was killed. Artemis has been running since 2017. If Artemis 3, the first landing, does not happen within the next 2 to 3 years, the program enters the danger zone where political fatigue outweighs political ambition. The rocket was designed by committee. The question is whether a committee-designed program can survive its own cost structure long enough to actually deliver on its promise. And that question has no answer yet. Part 10. Earthrise. So where does that leave us? 4 humans are out there right now, in a spacecraft smaller than most people's living rooms, moving through a void that is indifferent to everything we have built and everything we argue about. They are out there because of a congressional act signed in 2010, because of a risk calculus shaped by the ghosts of Challenger and Columbia, because of a procurement system that optimizes for political survival, and because of a dream that predates all of those things, the dream of going back. And in 2 days, when Orion swings around the far side of the moon and the last radio signal fades to static, something will happen that makes all of the politics irrelevant for 45 minutes. The crew will see the far side. They will photograph the South Pole Aitken Basin. They will float in the silence and know, in a way that no amount of simulation can replicate, what it means to be the farthest thing from home that exists. And then, as the trajectory carries them around the curve, something will appear at the edge of the window. On December 24th, 1968, Christmas Eve, the crew of Apollo 8 became the first humans to orbit the moon. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders had been circling the lifeless grey surface for hours, focused on their mission, photographing potential landing sites for future flights. And then, on their 4th orbit, as their spacecraft came around the far side, William Anders looked up from his camera and saw something through the window that stopped him cold. The Earth was rising over the lunar horizon. He scrambled for a colour film magazine. The cabin audio captured the moment, Borman saying, "Oh my God, look at that picture over there." Anders, already shooting, replied, "Hand me that roll of colour quick, would you?" And then Borman, "You got it?" Lovell, "Oh man, that's great." What Anders captured in that moment became known as Earthrise, a photograph of a small, blue, fragile planet hanging above the barren grey curve of the moon. It has been called the most influential environmental photograph ever taken. It was the first time humanity saw itself from the outside, a single, borderless world floating in an infinite void. No countries visible, no wars visible, just life, a thin film of blue and white and green, the only colour for 250,000 miles in any direction. That photograph changed something. Not in the science. The science already knew Earth was a planet orbiting a star, but in the culture. The environmental movement gained momentum. The first Earth Day was held 2 years later, in 1970. People who had never thought about the fragility of their planet suddenly had an image that made that fragility visceral. Carl Sagan would later expand on this idea when Voyager 1 turned its camera back toward Earth from the outer solar system and captured the pale blue dot, a single pixel of light in a sunbeam. But Earthrise came first. and it came from the moon. In 2 days, the crew of Artemis 2 will see the same thing, not from Apollo 8's close lunar orbit, but from their flyby trajectory, farther out, a wider view, but the same essential image. The Earth, rising over the moon. The same view, 54 years later, seen through different eyes. Think about what those 54 years contain. When Apollo 8 captured Earthrise, computers filled entire rooms and had less processing power than a modern calculator. The internet did not exist. Humanity had never detected a planet outside our solar system. We had never observed a gravitational wave, never imaged a black hole, never found evidence of water on the moon. The Cold War was at its peak, and the race to the moon was a proxy battle for global supremacy. Now, in 2026, the crew seeing that Earthrise includes the first woman and the first black astronaut to travel this far from home. The spacecraft they ride was designed not by wartime urgency, but by congressional negotiation. The program that sent them is not racing an adversary. It is racing its own budget. And the question of whether humans will walk on the moon again depends less on the physics, and more on whether a political system designed for 2-year election cycles can sustain a project that requires decades. But here is what I keep coming back to. Despite all of that, despite the $4.1 billion per flight, despite the heat shield questions, despite the committee-designed architecture and the risk assessments and the bureaucratic caution, 4 humans are out there, right now, tonight, farther from home than anyone since 1972, looking at the moon with their own eyes. And whatever decisions Congress makes about Artemis 3, whatever SpaceX achieves with Starship, whatever China announces about its timeline, this moment is real. These 4 people are there, and the Earthrise they will see is the same one that changed how humanity sees itself half a century ago. We chose safety over speed this time, politics over engineering, caution over ambition. We built a rocket by committee and funded it by the year, and we sent 4 people to circle the moon instead of landing on it, because the lander is not ready, and the architecture could not carry it anyway. Whether that was the right choice, whether the trade-off between institutional survival and exploration is one we should accept, depends on what comes next, on whether Artemis 3 flies, on whether we actually land, on whether this program survives long enough to deliver on the promise that put those 4 astronauts on that trajectory, and if it does not survive, if Artemis follows Constellation into the history of cancelled programs, then Artemis 2 might not be a stepping stone to the moon. It might be the high water mark. The farthest we went before the money ran out and the politics shifted, and a generation grew up believing that going to the moon was something other people did, a long time ago, in a world that no longer exists. I do not want that to be the story. I do not think you do either. But here is the thing about Earthrise. It does not care about budgets. It does not care about authorization acts or procurement systems or launch cadence. It happens because a spacecraft swings around the moon, and the geometry of 3 celestial bodies, the Sun, the Earth and the Moon, produces a moment of accidental beauty that reminds every human who sees it that we live on a very small world in a very large universe. That image has been seen 24 times by human eyes. In 2 days, it will be seen for the 25th, 26th, 27th, and 28th time. And no matter what happens to the program that put them there, those 4 humans, Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Jeremy Hansen, will carry that image with them for the rest of their lives. They will know what the Earth looks like from the moon. They will know what silence sounds like when you are farther from home than any living human. They will know that we went back, even if we only went part way, even if we are still arguing about whether we can afford to go the rest of the way. 54 years between Earthrises, the same view, through different eyes, from a different spacecraft, in a different world. The moon does not care why we came. It only knows that we are here. And right now, 4 people are proving that we have not stopped reaching, even when the reaching is harder and slower and more political than it should be, even when the rocket was designed by Congress and the timeline was set by budget analysts, and the whole program might be cancelled before it ever puts boots on the surface. They are out there, and the view from the far side is the same one that changed everything in 1968. Maybe it will change something again.